Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So we're on the second book of that small collection um, of, of, of books that fall effectively between the Vows and Honor collection, duology, trilogy, kind of two books and a short story, and a couple of short stories, really, when you add it all up properly. This falls between that and Arrows of the Queen. And the thing about the Arrows trilogy is that Arrows is the real start of this series. Vows and Honor does slightly predate it in terms of the first publication of a Vows and Honor story predates the publication of the Arrows trilogy. Arrows of the Queen, which is the first book of Arrows. But Arrows is really where it all started. So we're actually almost to the 9 books that I really consider to make up the core of the Valdemar series. And so before I digress into that, this Exile's Valor and Exile's Honor right before it, which we went over last week. To an extent, because I spent a huge amount of time talking about By the Sword, Carowin's story. These two books, and to a smaller extent, Take a Thief, which I'll be getting to next week. These two books really set up the social and political situation as it is in Valdemar at the start of Arrows of the Queen. Now, the thing about Arrows of the Queen, as I said, that's the very first book written in Valdemar, about Valdemar, and because of that, it kind of explains how Valdemar works in a very fundamental way that almost doesn't get explained in any of the other books. And it's one of the reasons why, even though the Arrows trilogy is not the best trilogy in the series, is not the best books in the series, I still generally would recommend people read it because it's the book that takes you through everything and how it's all supposed to work from the ground up. Now, Exile's Honor, last week, is all about Herald Alberich, who is from we now know, if you've decided to read these in chronological order, the traditional historical enemies of Valdemar Kars. And that whole book was the Exile's Honor is a really, really pertinent title, which one cannot always say about titles. Titles, after all, do not always manage to be wholly pertinent to the book, don't necessarily tend to be as pointed as Exile's Honor is. But Exile's Honor was all about Alberich wrestling with the internal contradiction of his morals and ethics in regards to the fact that he swore oaths to protect Kars. He swore oaths to protect the people of Kars. He considers himself Karsite. He feels that Kars is his home and the place of his culture and where his religion and, first language come from and all that stuff. He doesn't see himself as Valdemaran. He does come to see himself as a herald, but, he's Karsite Valdemaran in the way that somebody may be German American. You may say, this is where I live, but culturally, personally, I hearken back to, Germany or Austria or Lithuania or China or Japan or wherever, because that's where my culture and traditions all hail from. So Exile's Honor involves him wrestling with it and finding a way to compromise internally in terms of doing what is the honorable thing, both for the heralds who are doing good work that he believes in, who are good people and whose efforts should be supported because they are working against, in effect, by fighting Kars, they are working against a corrupt and problematic administration. But at the same time, the rank and file soldiers in the Karsite army are normal Karsites who don't deserve to be, attacked or anything else. This book, Exile's Valor, and I have to say, as a Canadian, that still always throws me off, these OR words like harbor or valor, which, to me should always have a U in them. I'm sure if there is anyone who is British or Canadian or possibly Australian, probably Australian, you probably also have that instinctive, you spelled that wrong moment. Anyways, Exile's Valor. In this book, we get the story of Selene's her 1 year period of being married. The thing is that we know this because, again, this was written after Arrows, and this is a all spoilers all the time zone. I'm not going to be ducking spoilers. Arrows of the Queen starts off with Selene as a queen without a husband because her husband died, and with a daughter who she's having trouble with. This book tells the story of how she wound up that way. And what you have is, at the end of the last book, the then current king Sendar died. He died in battle. He was flung himself into the fight, into the middle of a war, which is a thing kings shouldn't do, because he saw that it was the strategically correct thing to do, because if the king is in the middle of battle, if the king is out there, it's going to distract the enemy soldiers and send them all scrambling to go after the king, rather than sending them to go after, rather than sending their full forces against the Valdemaran lines. And he did it for that very specific strategic reason, and he died in the process. And several things happened. The king's own, the monarch's own Herald Talimir, his companion was killed, and because you have a very intense psychic bond between a herald and companion, it half killed him until a new Grove-born, because the monarch's own companion is the only Grove-born companion. That is, they appear by magic in the companion's grove, in companion's field in the capital, and they just kind of come into existence, and they're kind of like angels, only they're like horses. They're like horse angels. Whereas the rest of companions are effectively, from what the book tells us over time, and not that the heralds know this, they're effectively reincarnated people, reincarnated healers, reincarnated heralds, who agree to come back as companions. But the Grove-born are basically, an angel comes down from heaven and is plopped into a body. Because there have been other Rolands in the course of Valdemaran past, the names, Taver is, I believe, the name of, I'm not great with names. Taver is, I believe, the name of Talamir's first companion, and then Roland is the next Grove-born. And from what I've gathered throughout the series, they appear to alternate, so there's probably a certain degree of when a companion's, a king's own herald's, monarch's own herald's companion dies, either Roland or Taver sort of waits up in heaven until the other one dies and then cycles back around again. But if their herald dies first, then off they go to choose the next monarch's own. Anyway, Talimir, throughout this entire book, we have a lot of discussion about him being half in and half out, because he was nearly dead and his beloved companion was dead and he'd been chosen, and he's kind of sticking it out because of moral obligation, not because, he wants to live or anything else. And there's a lot implicit in this book that Talamir just isn't all there psychological. Like, he's totally there in terms of his intellect. He's still as sharp as ever, but he kind of wishes he were dead and in heaven with his companion, because he kind of got stuffed back into his soul, kind of got stuffed back into his body. Um, the bulk of this book, though, is, it's mostly Alberich and Selene's perspective. So we have Alberich's perspective as he's watching all of this and trying to follow up on some sort of a plot to do something to the queen. But we also get Selene's perspective, and she is a young queen who has just ascended the throne after her father died, and her father, who was still, in his maybe 50s or 60s, or like, he's not old. Um, and so his death is a double shock to her. It's sort of the double shock because he's her father, but he's also her king, and she's kind of, it was effectively unexpected. And so a large portion of this book has to do with Selene's grieving, and with the fact that Selene, being a young queen, has to constantly fight her council for authority to be the queen. Um, and she's constantly fighting them off, saying, "Look, I can't just marry anybody, and the fact that you're trying to marry me off just shows that you don't trust me at all, that you think that I'm incapable." And she even makes the very sharp point that if you guys rush to marry me, you're telling everybody Valdemar's monarchy is so weak that you need to put someone in place to prop it up. And that's not a good message to send to other countries. So she fights for the right to marry who she wants to marry, or at the very least to make a more judicious choice than all of the people being shoved at her. And then the prince of neighboring Rethwellen comes to visit, and she falls for him, and falls for him hard, precisely because while she hasn't been sheltered to a lot of things, she has been sheltered in that as a princess, it protected her from a lot of people trying to get in her pants who might have if she were just a young noblewoman or even an ordinary woman. It protected her from a lot of social climbers and a lot of stuff because a lot of people knew that they couldn't manage to land her. A lot of people knew they would have to make it past Alberich and Talamir and her father. And she was a herald, which meant that she wound up spending a lot of time between the ages of approximately 12 to 18 around other heralds who are fundamentally good people. That's why they got picked by, magical horses to be heralds, is because the horses have the supernatural ability to effectively read your personality and know whether or not you're a good person, and an appropriate person to be a herald. And so when somebody shows up and is romantic and talks to her about romantic stuff and says, "Oh, I totally understand how you feel, and my father just died and I feel terrible about it," and she walks right into the trap, and and pushes for a marriage, and she winds up married. And this cover image is of the final denouement of the book, the big climax, where Alberich, who has spent a huge portion of this book, an unfortunately large portion of this book, training young heralds in training, herald trainees, to do a sort of a polo-like sport as pseudo-war training, come to Selene's rescue because her Rethwellen husband has decided to try to assassinate her now that she has had a baby and there is an heir. And I am basically out of time, so next week we're going to talk about Skiff and a book that has one particular inconsistency that says to me that Mercedes Lackey was perhaps not quite paying attention to some other things. So that's everything, and I'll see you all next week.